name is Adesewa Josh. I'm a news anchor, correspondent, author, and your moderator tonight. Welcome to one of the most timely and crucial conversations of our time. What climate change could mean for international migration, courtesy of the Austrian Institute for International Research and Development. The purpose of this session is to present various perspectives on climate change and to provide insight on the topic climate migration and migrants. As we are all aware, our planet is experiencing some of the worst impacts of global warming. The Horn of Africa is experiencing the worst drought in 4 decades, driving countries like Somalia to the brink of famine. Pakistan, Nigeria, Ghana, the United States are experiencing some of the worst flooding and other natural disasters on record. Elsewhere, rivers are drying up, sea levels are rising, glaciers are melting, and oceans are warming. And the not too far future, climate migration are expected as a result of climate change. But what is that exactly? Who are climate migrants? How are they different from economic migrants? Has the great climate migration begun? How will it affect globalization, customs, border security? The questions are enormous. To help us make sense of it all, I am honored to introduce our speakers. And I will start with Professor Elizabeth G Ferries. She is the director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and a non-resident senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
And next is Professor Jacob Park, a visiting professor, University of Johannesburg, DSI, NRF, Newton Fund Trilateral Chair, and Associate Professor in Castletown University's College of Business. Oh, by the way, he joins us from Vermont, and Professor Ferris is joining us from Washington, D.C. And finally, Dr. Tanya Berger, Center for Environmental Sensitivity, University for Continuing Education, Krems. She joins us from Austria. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to all of our viewers who have joined us. Let's get on with the panel. And I'd like to start with Professor Ferris. Sure. You've done extensive research on all kinds of migration, including their root causes. We all know that migration in and of itself is not an odd phenomenon. People have been migrating from time immemorial, but it's often difficult to understand the predicaments climate migrants face or what makes them different from other kinds of migrants. So my question to you is, what is climate migration and what makes it different from all other kinds of mobility? The floor is yours.
That's a $64,000 question, how to distinguish climate migrants from others. We know that climate change acts as a force multiplier, that it never acts exclusively by itself, that it always interacts with the context, with gender, with demographic characteristics, with economic resources. People facing exactly the same environmental hazard may decide to move or may decide to stay. These are complex issues, and I think it's one of the difficulties in talking about climate migration is distinguishing who is a climate migrant. Is it everybody that leaves after a hurricane? What about people who leave after an earthquake, which is not a climate related hazard? How do you distinguish how do you identify this group of people? We know very little about whether those who move, in large part because of climate change, have needs that are different than those who move for economic or political reasons. There's just a lot we don't know in this field. I will make just a couple of comments of things that I think we do know. One is most of the literature and research is pretty clear that most people who move will do so internally within the borders of their country. They will move close to home or to a city in their same country. So while there's a lot of talk about international migration, I think we really need to look also at what's happening within the borders of a country. World Bank says some 90% of climate migrants will be internal migrants, and they certainly pose a challenge to cities and communities throughout countries who probably haven't yet started thinking about the impact of climate change on migration trends to their pattern. The UNFCCC has said way back in 2010 that there are three types of mobility to look at: migration, which is assumed to be voluntary, anticipatory, people who see the handwriting on the wall and then decide to move. And migration can be a positive adaptation strategy to climate change. Then there's displacement, when people are forced from their homes by rising floodwaters and usually need some kind of assistance to get back to their homes and restart their lives. We want to do everything we can to minimize displacement, that forced movement of people. And then the third form of mobility the Conference of Parties set out are planned relocations. What about when a whole area becomes uninhabitable and the whole community needs to move? How do you do that? These are complex undertakings to move a whole community, and the track record from other contexts isn't very positive, but at least it's something to be thinking about for the longer term, and hopefully the very long term, when whole communities need to move. Although this migration is already happening. Communities are already being moved by the dozens, by the hundreds. We know that many people are moving using traditional labor migration pathways, and for reasons that are related to climate. So I think this is a complex issue, and there are lots of things to unpack, and I'm just delighted to be joining you this evening.
Thank you so much, Professor Ferris, for that great answer. I'd like to ask if Professor Park wants to add to that. Who's a climate refugee? Who's a climate migrant? What is climate migration?
I have very little to add to Professor Ferris's excellent sort of taxonomy, but I would just add, sort of in terms of assuming that the audience listening to this have three different terms that I think get confused a lot. So let me try to unpack it as a way to complement what Professor Ferris has just said. Is migration, immigration, and refugee. I think these terms get overlapped a lot and people get confused. So in the time that I'm given, I thought it might be a good idea to do that. So immigration are terms, particularly for American viewers, it's a term between legally sort of where you have like documentation from one country to another country, so where you're crossing different borders. Migration is a much broader term to include both legal as illegal, or displacement, as Professor Ferris mentioned too. It is a broadest term, and this goes back to what you said, that people have been moving since beginning of time to do. So migration is the broadest sense possible. Refugee is a slightly different term, which basically means that you are given, and there's two different types of refugees in many ways, is that internally displaced, which is in-state, in-country migration. Technically, they're not refugees because refugee status only kicks in when you cross borders, right? So it seems kind of random, like if you cross a Pakistani citizen, for instance, a recent flood, crosses a border to, let's say, India or Bangladesh, that's where the refugee status is kicking in. And a lot of the controversy, I think, or fear, if you want to call it that, in terms of this issue is probably that embedded in this term refugee, right? It's almost like a fear on the part of the northern countries, the global north, where they just really fear. And we sort of saw this in 2016 with vast sort of migration, not immigration, but refugees coming from the Middle East and Southeast Asia and other countries to Europe, right? So this is when you're talking about climate change and migration, depending on who is kind of listening to this, immediately go to the term refugee, and that's where the fear comes in. But in terms of the broader concept of migration, and every country has their own immigration policy that is planned, regulated, and legal. And I think that the term that gets the most amount of attention, unfortunately, is like the refugees related to climate change, because it feels very much out of control. Nobody, it's almost like fear and controls about this. And I do think that in many ways it's important to unpack these terms because they get kind of used a lot interchangeably, which is incorrect.
Are you sure you didn't peep my questions? Because that's
right.
supposed to be my follow-up questions.
Okay.
Professor Ferris, but thank you for doing justice to that. Because basically it's true. It overlaps and it's confusing, and it's just, even for governments, and imagine if we don't understand this, driving and drafting policies to address some of the issues that you don't understand in the first place becomes very difficult. Before I come back to you, you said something about why refugees. Before I go to Dr. Berger, why refugee? The term refugee draws some kind of anxiety for communities, for people. I'm going to ask you why you think that is later. But let me quickly move on to Dr. Berger now and ask this question. And it's because your work on environmental sensitivity. As a journalist, I mentioned earlier that one of the toughest stories to report is stories of the impact of climate change on the people and their community, because it's often difficult to directly connect human activities to say, let's say, melting glaciers or heavy rainfall. I often always just quote. I just say, you know what? Don't quote me. Just the scientist said it. I just, because I personally cannot say from point A to point B, this is how it happened. So I guess my question is, what human factors and government policies in public places are contributing to climate crisis?
Well, I guess, I mean, we might all know the most common figures, and we might know about factors that contribute to climate change. Basically, the various facets of consumption, of energy consumption that are there in our, at least Western societies. But I would like to draw the attention to the fact that one of my Indian NGO partners describes very straightforward in the sense that he says climate change is something that is mostly caused by rich people, right, and from which poor people predominantly suffer. So that's I think it's a very straightforward statement, but it points out very clearly that the consumption of energy and everything associated with it in the broadest sense possible in our industrialized societies predominantly is what has caused the climate change as a whole, and what contributes to the further aggravation of the situation. And those who are suffering most from the consequences are generally speaking those who contribute least to this development, and whose energy consumption is reduced in comparison to what the average Western citizen is using day by day. So, and additionally, this divergence does not only exist between global North and global South. We also see it within our own societies in Europe, for example, in my case. So we see that also in our industrialized countries, there are groups of societies that are consuming a lot less than others, and who are, on the other hand, most vulnerable to the impacts. For instance, if we talk about urban heat, this is something that the poorest sections of our Western societies, of our European societies, are mostly exposed to, because they live in building stock that is least of lowest quality, and they do not have the means to protect themselves against the heat and the impact of heat. So this is just to draw your attention to the fact that global climate change has root causes and has impacts, and these are very unequally spread over the globe and within countries as well. So I think that is a point that is often forgotten when we talk about climate change. And then, of course, as you were rightly pointing out, it's not always that clear, and it's often difficult for people to understand how one thing, energy consumption, is linked to another thing, increase in certain extreme weather events, for instance. So that is something that I think is not absolutely obvious, and for many people this needs to be taken into the picture to be aware of.
So in the context of connecting climate change to natural disasters, and according to you, what rich people do and how it is affecting poor people. How do you explain to a poor person that what he or she is going through has got nothing to do with what he or she has done? And then how do you make them take steps to mitigate the impact of something they never did?
Well, I guess that's morally speaking, or from an ethnic point of view, this is actually not feasible. Yeah, how could you, as a Westerner living a lavish lifestyle, demand other people's to change their energy consumption while you are still continuing to do so? I mean, I think that is simply not doable. So I think, generally speaking, the industrialized world has a moral duty to rein in on its energy consumption, broadly speaking, and at the same time to support those who are already suffering from the impacts of climate change today, to support them in adapting to the consequences that we see, the consequences of climate change that we already see today.
Thank you so much for that very, very great answer. I'm going to throw my next question to Professor Park. That's your first question because you answered a follow-up question before I come back to Professor Ferris. And I wanted to talk about mobility, and thank you for clearing it up. Migration is what we do. People move all the time for different reasons, but what actually gets people on edge is this word refugee, right? Why do you think that is? Is it because refugee is another word for responsibility?
I'm sorry, did I, is that the end of the question?
Yes, I
Okay.
want you to answer that before.
I think the way to best answer that question, I suppose, is look at some more recent history. Let's go back to about 100 years ago, I suppose. And each country has a little bit different sort of pattern of migration, so it's really hard to speak in kind of generalities. But if let's compare, for instance, let's say Argentina, for instance, as a country versus the U.S. I draw that comparison in part because 100 years ago, Argentina was one of, if not one of the richest countries on this planet, right? Because of their natural resources. And they essentially, if you look at a lot of Argentinians, they have a lot of, last names that sounds like Italian because a lot of the people came to the United States. There's a fair number of Koreans actually came to Argentina. So we don't really think about it now, but in terms of certain countries like Argentina, 100, let's say 80, 90 years ago, a lot of people went to Argentina from Brazil, other Latin American countries, but also very far away from Italy, Asia, to take advantage of the economic opportunity in Argentina. So this is to show the historical kind of amnesia we have about which country was, receiving, and if you go back to or look at the history of the United States, we like to think, and as somebody who actually did immigrate to the United States as a child with this family back in the 70s, I have a certain kind of a personal kind of relation to this issue. And until the 1965 Immigration Act, it was from the end of the century, let's say from the teens, 1910s, to about 1965, it was very restrictive in terms of who actually came to the United States. And the first racialized ban in terms of entry was the Chinese Americans, which goes back to the late 19th century. I point this out because we're talking about mobility, but Americans like to assume that it was kind of, we once had this restricted borders at some point, and now there are all this floods of, Mexicans and Central Americans coming through it, which I believe Professor Ferris will mention because her role in Central American research. But there's this belief somehow that there was a point where there was highly regulated, immigration, migration system. Now we have this kind of people crossing borders all you want. But actually it was kind of open borders until not that long ago. And we need to kind of keep that in mind. So this idea of a kind of a regulated tightening of borders is actually in terms of story of the nation state, it's actually fairly recent. I think that's really the first point. The second point is that this is so politicized as an issue now in 2022 in the U.S., Germany. You pick the country, and there is no country in which migration, immigration, refugee is not a political issue. We just had an election in Sweden where the very right-wing party that has Nazi roots became the second largest party in Sweden. That kind of shows you how potentially and politically speaking, whether we're talking about Germany, Austria, there is not a country in which it's capable to do that. So the reason I mentioned this as a point is because to show you this topic we're dealing with, I know relates to climate change, but this has been a political hot potato as a political issue, social issue. And we all have to kind of like understand the historical roots of this issue moving forward, because there will be, as all three speakers probably will attest to, this will be an issue that even if we try to ignore it, we can, because either within the country and outside borders. I wonder what happens as a country like Pakistan, for instance, where they just made an appeal for hundreds of millions of dollars just to start up starvation after the recent flood. And what happens if they start the people, because they don't have resources within Pakistan, start marching across borders, get on a boat, go to Australia, wherever else they go to, and that is going to happen. What do we do as the international community do about that? And to me, these are questions they're dealing with. It's really not theoretical, because whenever there's a natural disaster happening in one part, there will be a forced kind of migration or refugee status that's happening. That's exactly what's happening in U.S. borders vis-a-vis Central America and Mexico. And again, Professor Ferris will probably speak to that. But when they're talking about Asia, Latin America, these are all issues that, as much as we would like to put blinders on and try to ignore, I don't think we can, because we're dealing with, according to the World Bank, 200 million people in country migration, displacement by 2050. One sociologist from Florida State, Matt Hauser, mentioned something like 13 million Americans will be affected by this. So these are not issues that no country will be exempt from. So I'll just pause there. Oops.
You are muted.
That was me. Okay, I have it back. Thank you so much. That was a very, very good analysis and answer. And I said, again, you peeped my book, because I was just about to talk about the some of the figures now. Figures are quite tricky, because also in journalism, we try to stay away from too much figures and humanize the figures and sort of put a face on the figures. But it's alarming. And I'm throwing this question to Professor Ferris. According to the UNHCR, an annual average of 21.5 million people have been forcibly displaced by weather-related events such as floods, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures since 2008. And experts are predicting, as Professor Park mentioned earlier, that 1.2 billion people. That's almost the whole of Africa, right? Just think about it very well. So,
I'm sorry, I said 200 million. I'm sorry.
You said 200 million. Okay, so
yeah. The World Bank groundswell report that came out in 2021.
Okay, this is another report by a think tank supported by UNHCR, I believe, saying that by 2050 there will be 1.2 billion people could be displaced globally due to climate change and natural disasters. So in the grand scheme of things, Professor Ferris, in the grand scheme of government policies, how do you think climate change will impact international migration? And would you say, if that has already begun, what should governments be doing about it? What should all this movement that Professor Park described, if Pakistanis want to move, the ones who are affected in their communities, they have a right to move, but how should governments respond to these movements within and also outside of their borders?
Yeah, let me first just comment on the numbers question. There are all kinds of estimates about how many people will be moving. I think this figure of about 20 million people every year displaced by weather-related disasters is pretty accurate. But
Mhm.
a lot of that
But the-
displacement is temporary. The flooding happens, and most people go home at some point. So it's not. It's different than conflict displacement, where oftentimes people are displaced for years or
So it's
decades.
not permanent, you mean? It's
And not
temporary.
always. Yeah, it's not always. I mean, sometimes it can be
Mm.
protracted, but
That's a good
I think migration researchers have moved away from the numbers. Right now, we've got numbers from 50 million to a billion people moving in the next 20 years, and different climate models, different understandings of what people move. I mean, we know, for example, the poorest people are the least likely to move. They don't have the money to buy a bus ticket or move to the city. It's when people have a little bit of money to meet their aspirations that that you see migration. So yes, I think there will be.
Migration is not cheap. It's not really poor people who are moving.
And
Please, you need to say that again. I say this every time I'm dealing with a migration story. I say, okay, people say, oh, Africans move, Asians move. And, we try to, this story has been editorialized like, oh, poor people looking for greener pastures. I'm like, I don't think so. They have money and means. The people who are actually poor, they are sitting at home, not even with no clue how to move. Professor Ferris?
Yeah, and I think that looking at those so-called trapped or immobile populations, people who don't have the resources to move, people who couldn't move out of the harm's way in Hurricane Ian this week in the United States tended to be those who are poor and living in the most marginal housing. And we're going to see that everywhere as well. I also wanted to comment on what Professor Berger said about, this is a justice issue. The countries that are most affected have the least to do with what is raining down on them. It's simply not fair. And increasingly governments are using this argument to push Western governments, and not just Western governments, but India and China as well, to reduce their emissions. I really admire the Pacific Island governments, these very small countries who face this existential threat of climate change, who have really put this issue on the international agenda. They've been talking about this for decades. It's just recently that it's made it into the mainstream. So, I think that part of government policy is to raise awareness about these major justice issues. And also on the policy front, very few governments in the world have developed policies on climate migration. I think it's just Fiji and Vanuatu right now. A few countries have specific policies on certain aspects, but I think national governments, and especially urban governments, municipal authorities, need to be thinking about what's going to happen, and are people going to leave, and are they going to come here, and where will they go, and will they be safe, and can government protect them, and how will we tax them? And there are a whole range of questions that, and no easy answers, but I really think that in order to ensure that migration is positive and not unfortunate, then governments need to be thinking about these issues in their own particular contexts.
Thank you.
If I may step in here, if you allow me to.
Yes.
because you mentioned the issue of cities, and my perspective is very much so from bottom up, so to speak. And I think one migration that's already going on and completely unnoticed is a worldwide migration, continued migration to the cities.
Right.
So we have, wherever you look, you have this rapid urbanization, which means that millions and millions of people are on the move from their rural ancestors' homes to the cities. And this is by no means an international migration, but still, as I said, it's millions and millions of people who are looking for a better future, simply said, because also partly maybe also due to changing climates, but also due to a variety of other reasons, their rural villages do not sustain them anymore, or do not provide them with sustainable livelihoods. And so we see this migration to cities, but we also see a lot of circular migration.
Right.
So people commuting between rural and urban life over decades. It's not that this is just a one-way migration. It often keeps on moving back and forth. So that is something that is partly related to climate change, but has lots of other root causes as well.
Okay, so Dr. Berger, just let me then ask you this next question, and I'll come back to you, Professor Ferris. Um, Africa accounts for the smallest share of global greenhouse gas. We know that greenhouse gas emissions at just 3.8% the last time I checked. But the continent is currently reeling from the impact of climate change more than in any part of the world, mostly because of a lack of climate resilience mechanisms. We talked about this before, backstage before the show started. What little changes can be made? And I know that Professor Ferris said this is a matter of justice. While we're waiting for justice to be served, how can poor people take care and look after themselves? Because it looks like it might take a while, as we know. So the question is, what little change? While we wait for COP27 and all these people pledging to cut down carbon emissions and holding each other responsible, how can people who are vulnerable, communities who are vulnerable, make little changes on an institutional and government level to mitigate the impact of global warming, especially in the area of public structure and housing where your work is focused?
Exactly, you're mentioning it. So it's these people, we are talking about those people who are most vulnerable, who have the least resources to adapt, to build back after disasters hit. And once we are looking at these cities, as I mentioned, I mean, cities like Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, which I happen to know a bit, these cities face an annual increase of population of roughly 5%, which is enormous. So this means that for these cities, who are normally also not having lots of means at their disposal, their infrastructure is simply overwhelmed by this influx of people. And on the other hand side, exactly basic infrastructure such as water supply, such as electricity supply, connection to sewage, for instance, that would all be measures to increase people's resilience to the impact of disaster. If you are living in a slum hut that has no water supply, for instance, in the case of floods, you're going thirsty, even though you're surrounded by water, as just one aspect of or one challenge that you're facing. So would there be a proper water supply that could help to increase your resilience in the case of an emergency? So that's, I think, providing basic infrastructure for the poorest people and for the newcomers in the city. That's the big challenge. And of course, budgets of city municipalities are often outstripped by this demand. And that's where the problem starts, so to speak.
That's right. Professor Ferris, so let's quickly touch on the issue of climate justice and who should be paying for what. There was a conference in the Netherlands 2 weeks ago, it was about a month ago. Global leaders were supposed to meet with African heads of state to develop adaptive resilience program. And it was just a couple of millions of dollars, to be honest. Not even half what the committee at COP27 said, they should all contribute. Did you know that only government officials from Netherlands showed up? They did not show up. And if I'm allowed to pass comments on that, that's pretty insulting to the hypocrisy of what COP27 stands for. And not to mention the whole two-faced, we want to do something. And then they have these leaders, then they have the audacity to ask some of the African governments to cut down on their coal consumption. I mean, you have heard what the head of the AU said about, no, you can't tell us that. You do not have the moral imperative. You do not have it to tell us to cut down. We're barely just making money and sustaining ourselves. We just came out of a pandemic, inflation. You're not even doing half of what you're supposed to do. And so there is this back and forth and who should be doing what and all. And then people are dying. People are moving. Budgets are strained. I mean, smaller countries are taking more people in. They don't have the money to help these people it's insane. How should the world address this whole global climate crisis justice? And who's going to be the police?
Well, we don't have a police, that's for sure. There aren't enforcement mechanisms. All the commitments made in the Kyoto Agreement are voluntary. I mean, we don't have an enforcement mechanism. But this justice issue is playing out in different ways. I mean, one way has been through adaptation funding, with countries saying, yeah, we understand that we're causing this problem, but we're going to make funds available so you can adapt to the effects of climate change. Well, so far that money has been far short of what's been promised. And also, I don't think any of that money has yet been used to look at migration as adaptation, to help governments do some of the planning, or to begin to put together projections of what could happen in their cities, their communities, their countries. So that's one possibility. More and more governments are talking about reparations. It's coming under this loss and damage mechanism of the UNFCCC process to say, if you're going to cause all this harm to our communities, then you owe us money to take the steps necessary to get out of it. These kinds of discussions turn into these highly politicized discussions between North and South, which we've seen in a lot of different contexts, which is kind of unfortunate, because there is a basic justice here. Countries that didn't have much to do with the impact of climate change are now being asked to adapt, not just to cut back on energy consumption, but also to think about relocating. I mean, I'm really appalled sometimes at the number of times I've heard respected people in Western countries say, well, Pacific Islands will just have to move somewhere else. Well, what does that mean, to give up your territory, your country, your culture, your language, your sovereignty, and just to have that kind of cavalierly dismissed? And the Pacific Islanders are saying, wait a minute, you cut down on those emissions so we can stay where we belong. And we have very strong links to the land here, and we don't want to move. Nobody wants to move from their place, at least not they're forced to do so. And sometimes there's this assumption, well, people can just move if it gets too dangerous, or the wildfires are too bad, or the flooding is too bad, they can just move. And it just isn't that easy. And I think we've got to recognize some of the deep attachments that people have to place. In the United States, I don't see that so much. People move all the time for jobs or family, but in some parts of the world, it's a part of their being, part of their religion. Their sense of attachment to place that can't be just swept aside with this, they can just move if things get too bad.
Thank you so much, Professor Ferris, for that beautiful answer. I'm going to go to Professor Park now, and I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the price of food, its connection to climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So the world is reeling from food inflation, partly because of the war in Ukraine. Again, Africa is being disproportionately affected. Again, climate deniers and people who are just generally not in tune with how powerful climate change is now these days on everything that we do, even up to policy level. Could you help our listeners connect the dots between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the current global food inflation? And when you're done with that,
right.
What can the most vulnerable countries do to build successful, sustainable food systems that's resilient to not just climate change, but also wars?
Right. So like all the great questions you've been asking, it's impossible to kind of give a kind of a succinct answer to a lot of this, but I'll try. But I want to start kind of build on a little bit on what first answer to your question about finance and kind of payment, because this is something, an area that I spent quite a bit of time been working on since probably the longest period of time on sustainability. So if you go back to 1992 Earth Summit in Brazil, one of the key sort of points in the Earth Charter, a lot of it's been kind of lost. It feels like it's early 90s. For some people, it feels like ancient history, but it really isn't if you think about it. It's only been 30 years since 92. And if you look at one of the key points of the Earth Charter was this idea that this really important idea of common but differentiated responsibility, right? The idea is that we all have a responsibility to protect the Earth, but we have a differentiated responsibility. And one of the key differentiated responsibility was the idea of finance. That is, it actually is part of the pledge that certain amount that would be dispersed or transferred from industrialized countries Europe, North America, Japan, and Asia, and elsewhere to middle income and low income countries. That's 30 years ago. And so although every year we talk about finance, and this is something in the very beginning, maybe not in 1972 when the first international conference was held in Stockholm, but really since the modern time, the 30 years ago, it was a sort of, and it wasn't until the conference, the Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, that the number of 10 billion figure was kind of floated. Then we have things like the Clean Development Mechanism. It's a long history of who should pay, except every year we talk about kind of, diminution of our goals, basically, where anyone who sort of proposed any kind of targets, that's been wiped away in terms of that. So right now in 2022, it's probably less support for the idea of a transfer, whether it's loss and damage or adaptation or mitigation, except for possible mitigation because there's technology and private sector component, carbon capture. Except for that, adaptation and loss and damage is pretty much the most controversial element of every annual climate change conference. And you expect, and this year, I fully predict, but in Egypt, nothing, if not, would be more regressive, given the financial problems that a lot of the Northern European, plus what, I'll get to your question specifically now, is in terms of it, because of what's been happening since February of 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and two things happened, right? Immediately, the energy prices went up, and the cost of fertilizer went up because it's also the major source of the resource for productivity. So that means, particularly for developing countries, Sri Lanka, India, the cost of input has gone up, right? So everything in terms of cost of productivity, and then you layer that with what's happening in places like Pakistan, where all the farming regions isn't flooded, and that's not a 6-month, 1-year issue. That's a decades in the making to do. So whatever Pakistan, I think I heard the most latest figure is 800 million. That's just a down payment on a longer sort of financial resource they're going to need to do that. So my greatest fear, unfortunately, there is no easy solution to this is where the macroeconomic policies and the meso policies and the micro policies all needs to work together. Unfortunately, they're actually working apart from each other. So when United States raises interest rates, that means the cost of dollar just went up, right? The value of the dollar. So almost every currency, most recently, the UK pound was almost equal to the US dollar, which has never happened.
Disastrous, yeah.
Right? So that means that when the price of dollar goes up, that means the debt held by all these countries also goes up, right? So we talked about in terms of economic resources. So now, because of higher inflation, and the Federal Reserve in the United States only has a domestic mandate, right? They have to control 2% inflation as the target. In trying to control for that, it has a ricocheting effects. There's huge concerns in Asian countries right now that because the value of the dollar is going up, their debt is going up, their largest markets, the price of good is going to, their competitiveness is going down. There is a really big concern among Asian governments, and every Asian policymaker is obsessing about this, whether or not they're going to go through a similar economic crisis they had in 1997, which is when I was working in Japan at that year and moved to the United States. So we all know, we may forget, this is the 25th anniversary of that economic crisis. And there's a big fear in 2022 and 2023, Asian countries will, middle income, high income, low income, all will suffer from that. So the problem of causing by this initial shock, I think, reverberate in terms of kind of like a macroeconomic policy that a lot of national governments are doing. So in trying to simplify this to do that is that basically in order to help the poorest of the poor, macroeconomic policies, domestic and meso policies, and local responses all needs to work together. And right now, all the trends looking towards where the most vulnerable get more vulnerable because of there's no budget to surplus to give as aid of any sort. So right now in the short term, it looks very pessimistic. I don't really see anything optimistic other than goodwill of human beings right now that I could see. In terms of policy, everything is working against some kind of climate action, increase development aid to the poor countries. I don't see in the short term that happening. It doesn't mean it won't happen, It's just that the policies on a macro, meso, the micro level, it's all working against that. I wish this wasn't the case. But what happened in February when Russia invaded Ukraine is simply the first step in a much larger kind of complex environment. It all means that the next couple of years situation, unfortunately, it will get worse before it gets better.
It's funny you said that, maybe in the end policies on the institutional and government level may not work, but, we might all have to rely on the goodwill of the people, which is sort of what you see reflects in NGOs, right, who raise money and do aid work. And even they now are running into issues because it's getting harder to raise all these funds for these multiple issues that are happening all the time. They all have to decide who gets what and who doesn't get what, basically deciding who goes hungry tonight and who wouldn't. It's really very disheartening to see. Wow. Can you believe we only have 10 minutes to go? We have a couple of questions coming in, and before we then wrap it up in the next 10 minutes, but I would like to take Ali Uja's question. He's asking, there was a terrible flood in Germany. How do you evaluate Europe's strategies against climate change? I think I will give that I'll let you all just chip in and before we wrap this up. So I'll start with Dr. Becker.
Well, that's a very broad question.
It is. Thank you.
I mean, I just recently attended a meeting of Austrian climate scientists who were quite desperate in a sense, saying that we have been warning for 50 years now, broadly speaking, about these issues coming up. And we are still not seeing any major change in the way that our societies function and the way that our societies consume energy and produce CO2 emissions, and also simply use up natural resources and diminish biodiversity and whatnot. So it's unfortunately I have to tune into the bleak picture just drawn right now by Professor Park. Yes, I mean I would not like to diminish the efforts that are taken up, especially by the European Union, to cut down on emissions. I mean, big flagship programs have been launched and are on the way, and there is a lot of effort going into research and development. However, if we look at what we see on the ground, it's still, I mean, we still have an increase in emissions, especially from the mobility sector. So I personally do not see the light at the end of the tunnel with regards to Europe's contribution to climate change. So, and adding to that, if I may swiftly also add on to what we were talking about, the impact of the war, I think it's unfortunately a really toxic situation in which now, I think for the first time that I can remember, here people are really talking about what the winter will bring. Let's see what the winter will bring here. Yeah. So, and given this situation that the European citizens are really afraid of the winter without Russian gas, they are, of course, at the same time even less willing to take in refugees or to spend on countries in need of support to adapt to climate change. So that's really a toxic situation, and yeah.
Thanks for painting that picture. And I'm just going to go to the second question, and hopefully we can. I'm going to toss that question to Professor Ferris, and hopefully you can answer it in like a minute and 20 seconds. And I'm going to leapfrog from what she said, the practical picture of winter is coming, no Russian gas, this war is coming, and all. And this person is asking, for the connection between conflict and environmentally induced migration, like the relationship.
Yeah, researchers have looked at this relationship for a long time. And overall, there isn't a direct relationship, but it seems pretty clear that climate change makes things worse, and that the process of things getting worse contributes to conflict, whether it's by migration of traditional pastoralists into farming areas, for example, that can lead to conflict, or when it comes to the way that these movements take place, or when it comes to just resource scarcity can be a driver of conflict. So, I mean, the feeling in the field, in the research field, is that, climate change really multiplies the impact of some existing problems, such as conflict and ethnic tension and economic scarcity, which all contribute to conflict.
Right. So we have like 5 more minutes to go, and one of the things I like to do is, as much as I like to talk about problems and analyze, I'd like to know, on a personal level, while we wait for policies to shape up, what can people do? What, on a daily basis, what can we do to mitigate the impact of climate change and hopefully stall its impact on international migration and refugee, whatever climate change does to people, and global warming does to people. So, for example, I know if I leave my water on for too long, and I like the sound of water gushing, it's actually therapeutic. But one of my science teachers back in the day said to me, when you do that, somebody's getting flooded somewhere in the world. And I'm like, what do you mean? It's my water. I'm paying for it. And like every time people ask me about climate change and global warming and flooding, that's the analogy I give, which is still very hard to picture, that when I put my tap on and I waste water, someone's getting flooded somewhere. So anyway, what practical steps can people take in their daily lives to, reduce the impact of climate change? I'm going to start from Professor Park.
I'll keep this short. I've had long conversation with people about this for many years. And the only thing I would say right now, this month in 2022, is let's not disengage from the world's problems, because I really feel like what COVID has done, and we need to talk about this, I think, is that our personal wellness and health challenges of different sort, and we're all going through different ways. Some people have it worse, some people have it better. I just went through some family health issues involving my son, which I don't need to get into. But what I really feel like is that because of our own individuals, particularly in developed countries, that we want to disengage. We want to not want to watch any more news. And I've actually had people that said they feel much better after not have to listen to news anymore to do that. And really feel like that I could totally understand this efforts to disengage from what's going on around the world. I don't want to hear anymore about flooding in Pakistan, what's happening in Somalia, what may be happening in Central America. Is this effort for mental health sake to disengage is palpable, is there. We could all understand it, right, to do that. And one thing we could all do is, yes, we need to do what's best for us in terms of personal wellness and mental health, but let's try, all of us, pick a region of the world or wherever, but really try to engage in terms of what is the most vulnerable people on this planet facing. And despite whatever you may be going through individually, by family, community, just try to carve out a little space for what might be a mother facing a situation in Yemen, Somalia, in other parts of the world. And I think that we can't do that as much as we, as academic researchers who do this for a living, I suppose, but could collectively, particularly
Right.
in the Northern European and Northern American countries, try to carve out a little time to maybe watch the BBC News. Spend some little bit of time on what's going on in the rest of the world. Because right now, I feel like this rush to disengage from everything that's kind of not good for my mental health is not helping.
Right.
I'm most vulnerable around the world. And right now, that's my greatest fear, is that rush to disengage is having this very dual screen effect where some people know a lot about what's going on and a lot of people don't know anything.
Professor Ferris?
Yeah, I think that there are things that you can do at the individual level, like recycling and watching consumption. But I think the really big change is going to have to be much more drastic than that. It's going to involve changing your ways of transportation and where you live and how many children you have. Those are going to have an impact on the environment, but pushing the governments especially to stop these carbon emissions. And I'll just close by saying I have a lot of hope for communities. You see what communities around the world are doing to adapt to terrible situations, and you just can't help but admire not just their resilience, but their enthusiasm at seeing ways that they can work together to bring about change in their communities. So I'm not overly pessimistic. The signs are all bad, but human spirit is simply amazing.
That's right. Dr. Berger?
Well, I also feel a little bit reluctant always to look at the individual and forget about the structural issues that force us to use our private car because there is no public transport, for instance. Right. So I think that should not be missed out of the picture. Notwithstanding, I mean, there are, of course, these very simple rules. Eat less meat, travel less, especially not by car and by plane. These are very easy things. I mean, very basic things. And then as a voter, as a citizen, don't believe populists who tell you that all of Africa is planning to come to Europe, in our case. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
That's not true. That's not true.
I have a whole episode dedicated to that on my show called Africa, by the way.
But they're in Turkey, though, apparently.
Oh, wow. This has been amazing, hasn't it? I've had so much fun, and I hope you guys have enjoyed yourself talking about this amazing issue. 1 hour went by so fast. I wish we had more time. And I'm being told that my time is up. I believe so. So I want to say thank you so much, Professor Elizabeth Ferris, Research Professor and Director, Institute for the Study of International Migration, Georgetown University. Thank you so much. Professor Jacob Park, Visiting Professor, University of Johannesburg, DSI, NRF, Newton Fund Trilateral Chair. Thank you for making the time. And last but not the least, Dr. Tanya Berger, University of Continuing Education, KREMS, Center for Environmental Sensitivity. You were all great. And of course, my name is Adesewa Josh. I'm a news anchor and correspondent. I have a show called Africa Matters on TR2 World, and I have had the most amazing 1 hour talking to you. Thanks to our viewers for sending in those questions, and let's keep the conversation going. Do what you can. If you can stop eating meat, good for you. I will do my best also. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.